Hi guys, I hope you're doing well today. I thought in this lesson what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about soul bass playing and a few little observations, having just written a book, R&B Soul and Motown Style Bass Lines. And what I found whilst researching that book and writing it is the tone to start with is really simple. Now, I recorded a couple of videos I did last week on this on a vintage P bass, and indeed all the book audio, the 100 grooves I did on a 68 P bass. This is a 1982 Ibanez Roadster bass. It's got a jazz bass pickup and a precision bass pickup, PJ configuration, quite common. So if I go onto the front pickup, you've got sort of, it's never going to be exactly a P bass sound, a PJ, but yeah. As P bassy as this one gets, you can roll some tone off. But when it comes to soul bass playing, and you've got your Motown in there, you've got all the different subgenres, Philly soul, all kinds of things. What you find is that it tends to be a P bass and it tends to be flat wounds. Now, I don't have flat wounds. These are relatively new strings. This is quite a bright sounding bass. If I put this in the middle here. It's quite bright sounding, but this is one thing you can have. Now this is a Barker mute. I bought this years ago from a guy who makes these really cool basses. I don't know if they're still around, but you can make your own. It's just got like a sort of foam side and a sponge side. But if I just wedge that down here, sometimes it affects the tuning. But now that's probably a little bit too muted, even for my liking. So you might just, get, this is the sponge side. What is this? Does this sound any different? Yeah, it does a little bit. But there you go. I mean, to me, that's the first thing about soul music. I love rock bass, and probably that's the next book I'm going to write. But there's so many different types of rock bass tone. You can play with a plectrum, you can play with your fingers, stainless steel strings and effects. With soul bass playing, it tends to be quite old school. So you've got flat wound strings, which this doesn't. But I'm just trying to darken the bass, this one, in any way I can. So I've got the P bass pickup soloed. If you've got a jazz bass, go to the front pickup, dial off the tone, and you'll get somewhere close to that. That's what Joe Osborne used to do. But in the book, David Hood and Jerry Jamott were like two players that used a jazz. Everyone else was a P bass person. So that's the first thing to say, is that the tone with soul bass is pretty simple. The next thing, I'll take this out actually. The next thing is patterns. For me, this type of music is all about patterns and feel. Two things really. Now I'm just making this up, and I want you to do this too. I'm just going to show you 3 notes. Here's a C. Playing that on the 3rd fret of the A string. And then an A and a G on the 7th and 5th frets respectively of the D string. You have the intervals of the G is a 5th and 2 frets higher, that A is a 6th, a major 6th. So root 5, 6, so I'm going root 6, 5 in this particular instance. Okay, put those 2 notes down the octave. So we've got A and G, 5th fret, 3rd fret of the E string. We put the drum beat on. I'm making this up, but it sounds a bit like soul music. And knock on wood, I'm adding in a note there. But what I want you to do, as a little thing to practice, is to play a C and then get your 5th and 6th. Make sure you know where they are. From your root, if you go 2 frets across and drop down 1 string, you get a 5th, and 2 frets higher than that, you get your 6th. Drop those 2 notes down the octave, and in relation to that same root, the 5th is on the same fret, and that 6th again is 2 frets higher. Now I always think this way. And just add in, I'm just doing very simple articulation there. It's sort of a half hammer-on, half slide thing. You can make so many notes up. bass lines up, using these very simple notes. And if you know where other intervals are lying around these ones, you can then sort of go a few levels deeper. Right next to that major sixth, 1 fret higher, is the B flat, which is the minor seventh. You get a lot of dominant chords in soul music. It comes from blues. And lots of soul bass lines, and this is the thing I found. They use extremely simple notes, and these are chord tones. They're notes that come from the chord. So, the root fifth, sixth, that's one example. Very, very common notes in soul bass playing. They work on any major chord. Another point I was going to make, actually, which I'll make now, is that you realize that soul was so incredibly influential to the funk players that came just after them. So we're talking, late 50s, 60s, and then you start to get funk in the late 60s with James Brown. And, Memphis Soul Stew, recorded originally by Tommy Cogbill, the live version's Jerry Jamot, starts to sound quite funky. And that little last bit is that root fifth, sixth that I just showed you. The other notes, by the way, root fifth again, octave, simple enough. And we've got that minor seventh that I was just alluding to there, that B flat. Could really boil down so much of soul bass playing to these notes that I'm showing you right now. I've done a few lessons on this, so I will point you towards the PDFs that you can use, download to start to memorize this. You got a root, octave, minor seventh again. There's that major sixth again. I'm just playing it a different way. And that fifth. So what you do is you just work on this, and then you just discover that so many bass lines used these great soul bass players, I think anyway, as inspiration, as prototypes to their bass lines. Loads of rock, there's no Rolling Stones without R&B and soul, and this is the same for so much music. Let me just review the patterns that I've already shown you, and I might do a couple of others. So we've got we'll do C. We're in C. That's your root note. And I'm jumping to a sixth, major sixth, and a fifth. That sixth and fifth, I can put down the octave. Lots and lots of bass lines just use that little pattern on their own. If you learn this, your ear should anyway strengthen, because you'll start to recognize bass lines as you practice. So do practice this the way I'm doing it. I'm kind of applying rhythms to it, aren't I, to bring them to life. So I would recommend learning intervals and scales in this way, because you're actually creating music straight off. 1 fret higher than that sixth was that dominant seventh, the minor seventh. Okay, that's there. Root, fifth, octave, minor seventh. So we've got C, G, C. And I'm playing the B flat on the same fret as the root note, just 2 strings down this way. And you can add in a few of these patterns together and they'll work. That's a very common thing you hear. I'm walking up from the major third, so in this case that's the E second fret of the D string, walking up chromatically. Jacko did a lot of that kind of thing. Now that would work more on dominant chords. We've got a major third. That's just a minor third there. So I'm changing tonality a bit. I might just pause with that actually and return to the major, just not to confuse things too much. That bass line, you never can tell. is even simpler than root 5/6. It's root 5. But approaching each just from a semitone or a half step below 1 fret that way. James Jameson in particular did a lot of that chromatic movement into notes. The jazz players do that all the time. I'm just going to make up a bass line on the spot with a drum beat. I'm going to use root 5/6. I'm also going to use root 5 octave and minor 7th, that pattern. And if I do anything fancy, it'll be a major pentatonic scale, and I'll show you that in a minute. So, very simple. Root, 6th, 5th. And back again. And that was that root 5 octave flat 7 pattern. Now this was my last lesson, was a little bit like this. So you've got a major pentatonic scale there. Which itself is just intervals, isn't it? You know, root, major 2nd, major 3rd, then 5th, major 6th. So literally is these notes. Now, after a while, I'm certainly never thinking that. I just know them as patterns, and probably more than that, I know them as sounds. Like I know, I'm not thinking, that's a 6th, that's a 5th. I'm not thinking that. I've done this so many times that my inside here knows what that sound is going to be, right? And that's what I recommend that you do, is when you're practicing, you use your ears a lot. And your sort of pattern recognition and ears, you connect those two things up and your ear will get really, really good. And this will very much help you with that. And there's really no greater music, I think, than soul bass playing to work on this, because you really do hear these patterns over and over again. I went to a bass clinic with Chuck Rainey years and years and years ago, and I didn't understand this at the time, but I do now. He was talking about soul bass playing. He played a lot. And he just said, something like, yeah, there's 5 or 6 patterns you need to learn, and that's it. You know, and I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I wonder what those are. Years later, I actually did the work and studied it, and there it is. Now, you could just buy my book and I'll show you all the patterns in there. But yeah, that plug aside, thanks very much for watching. If you do have any questions, you know, I talked a lot about intervals here. Tried to keep the notes relatively simple. To bring them to life, you need decent techniques so that you're not stumbling over the notes all the time. You need that. You need a good sense of time and rhythm. So that's to do with the metronome and playing along to drum beats. Yeah, that takes a bit of time. But once you've got those things and the actual notes that sound good and work, and you just practice every day to just bring these things closer together, you will get better at this, I promise you. So do give that a go. Watch some of my other videos. Do subscribe to the channel. And like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Cheers.